Okay, so we have most of our framework established now. We have all our reference planes and our reference lines, and most importantly, we've pinned that arch down so that it's flexing in a predictable and useful way. Now it's time to jump into the deep end of the pool. We need a few more things here to control our family, and all of those are going to be controlled through formulas. So when we go into the family types, we're going to be putting in some formulas, but some of these are going to get into trigonometry. So if you haven't dusted off your trigonometry book from high school in a while, now's the time. But don't forget, Google is a great resource. So let's go over here to family types, and let's give ourselves plenty of room to work here. And we need to start creating some formulas here to drive this. The first one we're going to look at is the calculated arch radius. We labeled it calculated arch radius because our intention was to calculate it. So that's my little placeholder to remind me to do that. When we were flexing the spring angle and the width, the arch was flexing correctly, but because the calculated arch radius is staying 16'3", when you flex either one of these numbers, it actually distorts these angles here of the two reference lines, and they no longer match the radius of the arc. So what we need to do is calculate the radius so that it keeps pace with the shape of the arc. We want the shape of the arc to essentially drive the angle of these two reference lines. So to do this, I had to do a little bit of research online, and I looked at what I had. And again, taking you back to high school math here, the width here is a chord length of the circle. So all we know is the chord length and the spring offset. And can those two values give us the radius? And it turns out that they can. It's a kind of ugly looking formula. And what I've done is, I don't feel like typing it, so I have compiled all of the formulas we're going to need in this family into this Excel spreadsheet called Family Notes, and this is included with the exercise files. And here is that sort of ugly looking formula right here. I'm not going to try and explain it to you because I understood it when I read it on Google, but not well enough for me to explain it to you. So go ahead and Google it yourself. But here is the formula here. We're taking the spring offset and we're raising that to the second power. We're adding the arch width to the second power. We're multiplying that by 0.25, and we're dividing the whole thing by the spring offset times 2. It works, trust me. Do Control C, and I'll come in here and I'll do Control V. And of course, the most important thing here is that the names of all your parameters have to match exactly what you wrote before. So as soon as I click out of here, I'll find out if I made any typos, and it looks like I did okay. Now, this is why it was so important to make sure that we have the geometry matching what we actually are planning to flex it to. So notice that it grayed out and it says 16'3", but it didn't flex. So we don't have to worry that something's going to break because it's going to try and flex in some unnatural way. But now what we want to do is test this by putting in a different spring offset, for example, and notice that that will have an immediate impact on the arch radius. Let's click Apply. And now you see that the calculated radius line is moving up. That changes the center point of both these two reference lines here and the arc itself. And so now this pi wedge correctly matches a slice of the circle. Let me go ahead and set this back to 6 inches and apply that. And the next little piece we're going to address is the angle. I want the angle here between these two reference lines. Now to get there, again, I did some research, and we can calculate this angle in here. This is called theta by the mathematicians, and that boils down to basic trigonometry because we have a triangle where we know this side and this side and this side. And so with the various sides of the triangle, we can calculate theta. So we know the chord length, okay, and that's the opposite. You remember your SOHCAHTOA. I can't even believe I'm saying this out loud, okay? It's been years since high school math, but there's the theta here, and that's the opposite side. And we also know the hypotenuse, which is the long side, and that's the calculated radius that we just determined. So using those two with a little bit of trigonometry, we can figure out what theta is. So we're going to add a parameter. We're going to call it theta, and we're going to make it an angle parameter. We're going to put it under other, And the reason for that is a lot of times what you'll see family authors do is they'll take the parameters that they really don't want anybody messing with and they'll drop them in other, and that usually kind of puts them down at the bottom of the list somewhere. So that's just sort of a little best practice thing that folks do. And let's go ahead and click OK there. So there's theta, but now what I'm going to do is create all of the missing parameters that we need from the Excel spreadsheet, and then we'll come back and we'll start adding in all the formulas. Okay, so that's all the basic parameters. Now let me go ahead and widen this box a little bit longer here so that we can see all this. I'm going to collapse down the identity data. We don't really need to be distracted by that right now. So if you compare what I have here on screen to the Excel spreadsheet, you can see I've created all of the parameters that we still need and assigned them to the different kinds of parameters. So number of bricks, for instance, is an integer parameter, and some of these are length and some are angle. Now, what I've done is I've put anything that controls the shape of the geometry, but that's going to be driven by a formula or that otherwise I don't want anybody to input anything in. I've put that either under constraints or other. I put it under constraints if I wanted them to see that it was a value that was important, but it's being controlled by a formula. And I put it under other if it's just a means to an end and I just want it out of the way. So this calculated arch radius is in dimensions because by default that's where it put it. So I'm just going to modify that and I'm going to move it to constraints. All I really want in dimensions is the stuff that my end user is actually going to type in. So basically I want them to input their dimensions and then those dimensions will drive everything else. You may come up with a different strategy when you're building your own families, but that's the way I did it here. So now I'm just going to take a couple minutes to jump out to the Excel spreadsheet, copy the formulas, and paste them in here into the appropriate fields. And we'll start with theta. Now, the way that I did this in the Excel spreadsheet is I have numbered them in the order that we're going to create the formulas to try and make it a little bit easier. So we mentioned before that we needed a little bit of trigonometry. So here it is. If you want to do the arc sign, you type a sign and then the formula. So I've got that there. You can look this up in the Revit help if you want to know the complete details on the syntax. I'll copy that and I will paste that into theta right there. So I've completed pasting in all of the formulas from the Excel spreadsheet, and you can see that most of the values have now grayed out because they're being controlled by these formulas. Let me just point out a few things here that we've done. We, of course, calculated the angle. We had to convert it to radians. Now, again, I understood what radians was in high school, and I understood what it was when I was reading it on Google, but I'm not going to try and explain it to you now. But notice it's got the pi symbol in there. So the way you write pi in Revit is pi, open, close, parentheses. There are some syntax issues here. Over here, for the brick width, I've sort of taken a loose approach to it. I'm assuming a relatively standard brick, and I started with a value of 8 inch. And I just divided that by 3. And that's giving me this number of 2 and some fraction. We could obviously put in a much more precise brick width, but what I'm trying to do is get an overall size of the brick without worrying too much about mortar. We're going to be moving these bricks along a curve anyway. So in the pi wedge, we're going to have little gaps that's going to represent our mortar. So graphically, it's going to appear correctly for most scale views. If you zoomed in super close, then yeah, the mortar wouldn't be 100% accurate. We could address that if it's important to you, but in this particular example, we're going to keep it relatively simple and focus just on the bricks. So that's where I came up with that number. Finally, up here, I'm using a new feature in Revit 2012, the round up feature. And this is because I want to end up with a nice even whole number here. So it's taking this number into account and using the calculated soffit length, which is the length along the curve, the actual circumference of the curve, and it's dividing that by this brick width, comes up with a number, but it's rounding it up to the next whole number because otherwise I'd end up with a little sliver of brick on the end, and I don't really want to do that. I want to have nice whole bricks. So this may be the size of the brick, or it might be slightly larger or slightly smaller. So once we've got all of these formulas in here, we can click Apply. Make sure that we don't get any error messages. If we didn't get any error messages, then that means they're all functioning properly. If you like, we can create another family type. Let's try another size, like 72 wide with a 9-inch spring. Click OK. And that means that I need to change the spring height here to 9 inches and the arch width to 6 feet. And let's click Apply here. and you should see everything adjust there in the background. And so, assuming that you got the same result I did, congratulations. I know this is the most complex family I've ever created. It's probably the most complex one that you've created as well. We're going to go ahead and click OK here. And in the next movie, we're going to actually finally add some geometry to this.